Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program 754, May the 19th, 1986. There's a new book out by a gentleman, Roy Rowan, published by Little Brown, called The Intuitive Manager. The articles about this book have interested me because there is not much attention paid to intuition and the role it plays in making very major decisions or take chances. But there's a quotation in this book from John Sears, who was a campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, and he said, in quotes, Ronald Reagan is the embodiment of a peculiar American virtue that says all things are possible if you make them so, that reality is an illusion that can be overcome. Now, it is very good to have actors such as Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II or Evita Peron, an actress, in the role that they studied drama, then went into the real-life role because reality behind these people was always terribly different from what the real world is, and their role as actors was to pass on the illusions to us and not the truth. I went to a luncheon today at Pebble Beach put on by an organization called The Forum. Its purpose is to stop the arms race, to slow down the weapons purchases and the experimentations with them, and hopefully to find some way to have peace. And the guest speaker there was Daniel Ellsberg. That's why I decided to go to the luncheon. And it was just 15 years ago that the Pentagon Papers broke. If it hadn't been for Daniel Ellsberg's news and publishing the Pentagon Papers, I don't know if I would have started my 1 hour week on the radio. I started that by invitation from KLRB at that time to talk about the Pentagon Papers. And what I said in the very first broadcast was the way the government lies and has lied in the past, and going back to the political assassinations, and then, of course, the war would be easy to lie about, and the purpose of killing these other heads of states, or would-be heads of states, was to get that war going. The subject that he talked about today was about presidential lies and his disillusionment in finding in 1969 the lies about Vietnam and why we're in Vietnam and that we couldn't win the war. Now, Daniel Ellsberg worked in the system. He didn't question in 1963 the instant questions that people were asking about who murdered John Kennedy. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was murdered, and Reverend Martin Luther King, and maybe this seeped into his subconscious that something was going wrong here. And by 1969, he wanted to tell us about the White House, the lies in the White House, and then if you take it a step further, the president doesn't make up things that he's going to keep from us, little white secrets. He has to have help or suggestion on these activities by the Pentagon, by the Secretary of State, by the National Security Agency, by the Secretary of Defense. So there's a team behind the lies who know what they're going to do, but don't tell you what they're going to do. And then, of course, there's the media and people like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather, and the mass media, Bill Moyers, who passes himself off as a liberal, or Tom Braden on CNN, from the left, he describes himself, who are part of the intelligence establishment, who keep the big lies going. And years later, we find out in various ways that they have lied to us also. And they are part of the scenery that manipulates the illusion that the president uses to think he's fooling us, and now he's taking us right to the brink of World War III. Now, one of the subjects that is very important that has been ignored for a long time is the use of known war criminals for America, for Great Britain, for the intelligence community in Germany, and lying about their past, the most notorious being Mr. Waldheim, Kurt Waldheim, who will probably be elected president of Austria in June. Another massive liar is Simon Wiesenthal, who just this week was attacking Israel Singer of the World Jewish Congress for causing anti-Semitism in Austria by indicating that the Austrians would have trouble by electing Waldheim. And Wiesenthal says, it's not my habit to attack people. I want to see the evidence. And so far, he's found no evidence that Kurt Waldheim was a war criminal, and he attacks the Jewish organizations instead, and that's exactly what Simon Wiesenthal is paid to do. The New York Times, April 25th, just 2 weeks ago, has a long article. An Austrian OSS man is linked to Kurt Waldheim. And this is written by a woman, Elaine Cialino, for the New York Times. And she says that the first foreign minister in Vienna after the war, his name is Karl Gruber. He's 78 and still alive today. He was foreign minister from 1946 to 1953, had a personal secretary, Kurt Waldheim, who was on his staff, and he traveled with Mr. Gruber to the United States, even to Moscow, to London, wherever they traveled together, representing the Austrian government as the foreign minister, and that the reason Waldheim was on his staff when he was Austrian foreign minister is that it came from the recommendation. He came from his first secretary, Fritz Molden, M-O-L-D-E-N. And Molden gave a strong recommendation about Waldheim working for him as his secretary, traveling secretary, and Molden was heir to the Austrian publishing empire. Now, if he was heir to the empire of the large publishing empire, then he had to be there when Adolf Hitler was there, and the empire was functioning when Otto Skorzeny and the network was set up of the Odessa, and when the top Nazis were retrenching, as of the book, the Nazis go underground to get ready for another try against the Soviet Union eventually. Now, Molden gave Waldheim a strong recommendation, and Molden said he investigated Waldheim, investigating being in quotes, and he found nothing material on him. Now, remember that Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun and Reinhard Gehlen and 600 other top scientists came to the armed forces, to the rocket stations, to Huntsville, Alabama, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to Dallas-Fort Worth areas, such as Walter Dornberger, who were known war criminals, but we use their expertise, and their papers were sanitized so that you wouldn't know if they were war criminals, because Mr. Molden was saying that Waldheim is clean, but then later Mr. Gruber admits he never even asked him what he did during the war. Now, Mr. Molden, 2 years after Waldheim was recommended to work for the foreign minister, married the daughter of Allen Dulles, who later was on the Warren Commission, who I have been accusing of hiding Nazi war criminals and using known Nazis for the murder of John Kennedy and being involved in this Nazi network. He married the daughter of Dulles. Dulles was described in the New York Times modestly as a lawyer, prominent in the OSS during the war. He was more than that. He came out of the offices of Sullivan and Cromwell, same offices of Mr. Adams, who set up the AGS, Advanced Genetic Sciences, out here in California, just coincidentally. But he was part of Operation Sunrise for the OSS in Bern, Switzerland, where he was meeting SS Karl Wolff, the liaison to Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler, while Wolff was running Treblinka prison and concentration camp. He was meeting with Allen Dulles and the top Nazis, and Richard von Weizsäcker, whose son is now president of Germany. So the Gestapo and the Waffen-SS worked closely with the OSS, and the recommendation for Waldheim to work for the foreign minister is not surprising considering all of this activity, but it is surprising to learn that Allen Dulles' daughter married the head of the Viennese publishing empire. Now, Allen Dulles became deputy director of CIA from 1953 to 61. He was CIA director 1961 to 62, and then John Kennedy fired him. He said, "There's a hidden government behind my back," and instantly after Kennedy was murdered, Allen Dulles was put on the Warren Commission to, in quotes, rule out any conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. So Joan Dulles, whose father was in the OSS and then formed the CIA, married Fritz Molden, and Molden gave the recommendation for Kurt Waldheim to be cleared, and his activities with the Greek and Yugoslavian massacres were totally covered up. And also remember later that I accused Allen Dulles just about 4 months ago, the months go so fast, of his role in the murder of Dag Hammarskjöld, and the relationship of Dag Hammarskjöld from Sweden close to Olof Palme, and I linked the evidence of the Waldheim past to one of the reasons that Olof Palme had to be murdered at that particular time, because the election's coming up in Austria. So far, I've never seen anybody make those connections, but there's more on that, and the Yugoslav links and the British links to British massacres that I'll go to in a few moments. But after a brief chairmanship, just a few years, maybe 10, which goes quickly, as head of the UN by you thought, Waldheim became head of the United Nations. And Allen Dulles' connections to Waldheim by his son-in-law recommending him to be Secretary of the Foreign Minister in Vienna is brought up in this New York Times article, that it fuels concern that Waldheim's wartime records were kept secret, and also Fritz Molden, Allen Dulles' son-in-law, and Waldheim were school friends in Vienna. This is a time period in 1944 when Waldheim was talking about the resurgence of Germany. They both joined the Austrian Foreign Service in 1945, but the New York Times article doesn't say if that was how far ahead that was before the war was over. Did they work for Adolf Hitler in the Austrian Foreign Service up till the end of the war, which would be in May of 1945? And the article says now there are questions about whether Kurt Waldheim's work as a lieutenant in the German Army Command, when he worked against the Yugoslavian partisans and the deportation of Greek Jews, was suppressed by the governments. When Waldheim became Secretary General of the UN, he was elected in 1971, again in 1976, no questions were asked, and the question, of course, remains, why did Yugoslavia never complain or explain that they had papers on Waldheim being a war criminal, but suppressed them all of this time? Now, Mr. Gruber said he hired Waldheim as his secretary as soon as the war was over in 1946 on the recommendation of this head of the empire, of the publishers in Vienna, and this man then goes on to marry, in 1948, the daughter of Allen Dulles, and the subject is brought up why Mr. Gruber, as foreign minister, didn't check out the background of Kurt Waldheim and what he was doing during the war if he's taking him on as his foreign minister as soon as the war was over. And he didn't rule out the possibility that Waldheim had connections with Americans after World War II, and this may help to explain how somebody like Helene von Damm from Austria comes to the United States by way of William Clark, Ronald Reagan's close friend, and works for Otto von Bolschwing in Sacramento and in Sunnyvale, California. And von Bolschwing becomes the head of the Galen operation. She was a secretary to Reagan as governor for 8 years in California, then in the White House for 4 years, and became the ambassador to Austria, where she now lives, and married a wealthy gentleman from Austria. That's his home base. And the New York Times article says it was probable that Mr. Moulton kept up his connections with the United States intelligence because of his father-in-law, Allen Dulles, who might say, work a little for me. But I have an interpretation that the Austrian, Kurt Waldheim, said to Dulles, you work for me. It seems we're working more for what the Nazis did or want than what the Americans originally intended or wanted, or I would like to think they didn't intend things to be this way. The article concludes one of the reasons Gruber wanted him for his secretary was that he kept up his connections with the American intelligence. He had good standing with the Americans. Kurt Waldheim did, and as Karl Gruber's secretary, Waldheim went on these trips with him, and he knew that he had served in the Balkans from 1942 to 45, but he just said, I never asked any questions. What he did during the war or in the Balkans was never given much importance when he was under consideration for a job. I needed a personal secretary, and we don't ask very much from these people, and he said it wasn't important. My main concern is Austria, Gruber testified, and he went before the House Subcommittee in Congress on Human Rights and International Affairs and said the only thing that really matters is Austria. Now, Yugoslavia wasn't the only country that kept the war records of Kurt Waldheim secret. There's an article, May the 3rd, in the San Francisco Examiner. France had early data on Waldheim. The French government knew that Kurt Waldheim lied about his World War II activities as early as 1979, and while he was still Secretary General of the United Nations. And as new revelations come out, this article says about his records, they came across some diaries that he had written, and the Justice Department said that the Senate will put pressure on Attorney General Edwin Meese, but it will be unlikely to influence their decision to let him enter the United States again. The new documents that have been obtained by the World Jewish Congress show that the French government checked Waldheim's record, his personal record, in West Berlin in 1979, and it didn't indicate why the check was made or why its contents were not made public, but Senator Pete Wilson introduced a resolution that the Justice Department should act quickly on the question of barring Waldheim based upon these documents and the evidence. There's a wartime diary of Waldheim's in 1943, discovered by a professor at the University of South Carolina, a history professor, I mentioned him before, and about his work in capturing Greek partisans and sending them to slave labor camps where he knew they would be killed, and his activity for the Yugoslavian government. Now, an interesting article in the Los Angeles Times, May the 17th, is titled British Order Probe of Possible Link to Waldheim. And the reason the British article is, the article about Great Britain, is of such interest to me is at the same time that Olof Palme died in Sweden, that same week, Lady Fleming died. She was married to the scientist, Dr. Fleming, who discovered the penicillin, and she came from Greece, and she was a resistance fighter during World War II, and then fought the Greek military junta that the United States put in 1967. And I believe that her death and Olof Palme's death just came so quickly together because of the strategic position they were in to give any information to support the facts that were coming out about Kurt Waldheim and his past criminal record. The article from London says the British government has ordered the examination of military records to determine if Waldheim was involved with the disappearance of captured British commandos during World War II. Waldheim was accused in a House of Commons motion Thursday of involvement in the disappearance of unspecified numbers of Britons while in the German army in the Wehrmacht in the Balkans. It was signed by 45 legislators that said there's a link between Waldheim and the deaths of British commandos who were taken prisoners. Without giving any details, it said that Waldheim was in charge of interrogating the British, and then they were sent to their death. Alf Morris, the opposition Labour Party, one of the legislators who signed the Commons motion, asked Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in a written question why her government was unwilling to seek from the United Nations copies of documents in their position relating to Waldheim's wartime activities. Now, keep in mind that Klaus Barbie has been in jail in France since 1983, and this is 3 years now, and he's not going to trial. It doesn't look like he'll be going even for a long time, and he was part of killing the resistance during the war and after the war, used by the CIA. And now we have the gentleman who referred Mr. Waldheim as secretary to the foreign minister of Vienna, married shortly after the war. There wasn't much time, to the daughter of Allen Dulles, of all people. There's another large article in the New York Times by the same lady. This is April 24th. United Nations archives bar unlimited access to war criminals. Israel is told it has to prepare specific questions for files on war crime suspects. The article says the United Nations refused to give access to files on 40,000 criminals and suspects and witnesses in their archives. In light of this refusal, Israel is compiling a list of suspected war criminals it believes are still alive and in the hope of finding. And maybe this is the time to write again to the Israeli government and ask about Mr. Fritz Kramer, and is that the war criminal who came to the United States, the plans officer of the Pentagon. I asked Daniel Ellsberg if he met him. He said he had lunch with him one day, the fellow with the monocle, but doesn't seem too interested in finding out if he was Adolf Hitler's general before he was giving Ellsberg orders and the other people orders in Vietnam. And then, of course, following what's happening all over the world, you can see the influence of Mr. Fritz Kramer on Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and our entire Defense Department. But the New York Times says in this article about Waldheim, we think there is something very wrong in the denial to open access to the material. The credibility of the UN is in the balance. That there are 40,000 files collected from 1943, 2 years before the war was over, to 1948, when Allen Dulles' daughter married the man who recommended Kurt Waldheim to the foreign minister of Vienna. And this United Nations War Crimes Commission has been operating in London. The commission has evidence from the governments of its 17 members, investigated the charges, and opened files on individuals classified according to capability. 17 governments have to have a master list, according to this article. Members are Australia, Belgium, Britain, Canada, China, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, India, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, South Africa, the United States, and Yugoslavia. The commission was disbanded with no clear rules governing access to the files, and in 1949 there was a debate about the United Nations members and the United Nations officials, whether they should see the files or have them closed, and so far they say Israel has made no formal request for full access, but has only up till now brought up the subject in a conversation with the United Nations Legal Council, and they were told that a request for a full access would present legal problems that it would take months or years to resolve. Mr. Ben, B-E-I-N, called on other governments to request access to all the files, saying they were not turned over to the United Nations to keep them in a closed, dark room. They weren't there to be locked up, and the question is, what are they doing there? They also said that the Waldheim story raises serious questions concerning wartime activities of others such as him, and Waldheim is now running for president of Austria, and the United Nations War Crimes gave Waldheim its most serious classification, A. That's for accused war criminal, indicating there is a clear-cut case that has been presented against him, and that he should be delivered up for trials that he did during the war. The other category is S, a suspect who appeared to be guilty, but the government never got enough sufficient evidence, and C are for cases that are adjourned, used later for purported war criminals who could not be identified, and W is for witnesses of the war crimes. So the New York Times has an article about their holding back these various names and not wanting to share them and making it sort of a witch hunt. You tell us who you want, and we'll see what we have on that person. There's an editorial in a newspaper recently published 3 days ago that criticized Waldheim for making remarks where he said if he were elected president of Austria, he would have a president who equates the People's Liberation Army with the Wehrmacht. This is in a newspaper recently in Vienna or Germany that they were quoting Waldheim, that a People's Liberation would be like the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht were victims with criminals, the occupied with occupiers, liberators with aggressors. Now, Germany went into these countries, and Waldheim has been complaining that the Germans are victims of terror when the people in the country were defending themselves. So this is a scandalous editorial done recently, 3 days ago, criticizing him for making the remark that the Wehrmacht were people that should be considered equal to the liberators, and that gets back to Ronald Reagan and his idea of who the freedom fighters are, actually representing corporations. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, Israel asked the UN, again, to open the forgotten files, and this is some more about their holding them back and saying there is very little activity written in those files, and previously the files were opened up for Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie, Adolf Eichmann. These are the top people that ran the German government who we know about, and of course they don't even mention Martin Bormann. And speaking of Mengele, I read this week that Bonn is sending several people down to Brazil to verify, in quotes, the identification of Joseph Mengele, which is not Joseph Mengele, but there are at least 4 people who in testimony and in trials have said that Mengele was alive as of February of 1985. So Germany can't give the kiss of approval yet, but the United States government has said it's absolutely Mengele, and I want to update more on that for you. The Washington Times had an article April 15th. New charges say Waldheim deported Jews from Greece, and in all fairness, even Reverend Moon's paper and Arnaud de Bourgegrave have carried a lot of large articles about Waldheim and his past record. I don't think it's a coincidence that several people attacked Ronald Reagan in speeches just recently for being similar to Hitler, and there was a large picture of Vernon Walters in the Houston Post. Under it, it says, the comparison with Hitlerism is disgusting, and this has to do with the United Nations, where an anti-climatic Security Council debate was going on with a Cuban foreign minister, and he compared Ronald Reagan with Adolf Hitler, and our U.S. ambassador, Vernon Walters, was shocked. He said, this is horrible, it's disgusting, and he didn't like the comparison of Hitler going into undeclared areas and bombing them and taking those countries, and the comparison of Ronald Reagan's behavior in Libya and elsewhere in trying to overthrow countries identical to the way that Adolf Hitler moved. I didn't do much about Hitler's bash, his birthday this past week, a week and a half ago. It'll be soon. The usual number of people come out throughout Germany and have their meetings and celebrate Hitler's birthday was in April. And another article from a newspaper, anti-Semitism in West Berlin is worse than ever. It's a quotation of Heinz Galinski from the West Berlin Jewish Community Center, saying that it's stronger now than at any time since Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. The Jews are getting threatening letters, insulting letters, there's graffiti and so forth, and when they commemorate the 43rd anniversary of the end of the war and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they met their worst criticism and violence and anti-Semitism, which they compare to Nazi Germany. Now, Vernon Walters was outraged, our UN ambassador, to the fact that Ronald Reagan was compared to Adolf Hitler. Vernon Walters is a Knight of Malta from the Vatican. He also is a long captain of the intelligence community. He was deputy director of the CIA, and he was behind every major coup that this country effected since World War II, along with Allen Dulles and Wild Bill Donovan. There are pictures of Vernon Walters going to London and meeting with the heads there before we bombed Libya, trying to get the approval of our allies so that it would be like a united joint thing, not just Hitler on his own, but we would have the allies behind us. And the New York Times has a picture of Vernon Walters titled, "Walters Lobbies Allies to Act Against Gaddafi." That was April the 14th. And another Washington Post story, that was New York Times, Walter discusses terrorism with European leaders, and this is when he went to Germany to meet with Helmut Kohl, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, to persuade him to take tough actions against Muammar Gaddafi, and the Germans and the United States should unite and make a strike against Libya, which Germany didn't do, but Margaret Thatcher went along with the idea. Now, I'm going to Vernon Walters and his role in instigating coups, and as his director of the United Nations, and tying together the kind of lies that our president tells by giving you a story, a sketchy story, that came to me this weekend that I'll update for you and fill with you because there are court records on this story, and it has to do with what's going on in Ethiopia at the present time, and Vernon Walters of the UN, who encouraged the bombing of Libya and who is probably number one liar next to Kurt Waldheim, along with Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and Allen Dulles and William Donovan and William Casey. He has been the Cold War, hot war liar, and I want to make some connections to his United Nations organization and what he is doing now. For the sake of some of this, I'm going to leave names out until next week or the week after, but this story reminds me that I'm going to tell you when I was first starting on KLRB, and I was on the air just 2 or 3 months, and many of you remember going back to that time period where I got pictures of people from the Nazi Party at Fort Ord who were planning to put botulism into water, not in our area, but to the Great Lakes of Michigan, and poison the water in the event that this country went too far left. And this was the first time I'd gotten any information and pictures and names of people that had links in Monterey County and in the military to Nazis in the area in the back east who intended to poison this country and spread their poison around chemically and so forth. And I gave it to the FBI and the proper authorities, and they began to move on that, and then later it became public information, not crediting me, but you saw the story break about the Nazis and botulism, and you can look it up, and the intent to actually put poison into the waters in this country. Now, I got a call from a person who's known my research for years, who lives in the Santa Cruz area. He hasn't listened to World Watchers for a while, so he wasn't up on what I was saying about the Middle East, but he has befriended a person, I won't give you his name, who has come to this country from Ethiopia and from the Sudan, who speaks the languages of that area, 4 or 5 of them I understand, who was brought here from Bakersfield, California, just coincidentally the home of the killer bees. Never explained how they got here from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I mentioned those a few times. He was brought to Bakersfield and then to a small college, Cabrillo College, which is north of Carmel and Monterey, but close to UC, University of California College at at Santa Cruz. There's a campus, UC Santa Cruz, and there's a small college, Cabrillo College, not so well known, that is a state college in the same area of Santa Cruz and Aptos. And this fellow was brought from Bakersfield, and I have to fill this in, to Cabrillo College and was just the past couple weeks approached by a person whose name I have, and there are 5 offices under the guise of the United Nations, and was told he was to go back and do some murders in Ethiopia, kill 1 or more people, some heads of states, under the cover. The offices that the people work with that wanted him to do these murders are the African Aid, the Ethiopian Aid Program for the starving Ethiopians. And I have the name of the one person who runs an office across the street from the college. 5 people have been named in a suit, and I have to get this from the county and look it up and talk with him. There's a civil suit naming 5 people who put a hold on his money and income in exchange for his going to Ethiopia to do some murders. Now we'll take a 1-minute break, and then I'll get back to this story of Ethiopia, United Nations, assassinations, African aid, and some of the scandals behind this story that's developed out here on the West Coast. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of broadcast number 754, and I'm going into the subject of Ethiopia. Vernon Walters as the UN ambassador, because he had a major role in every political assassination for the intelligence community, along with Alan Dulles and William Casey and William Donovan, and what is cooking up, as I say, in our own area. I have a document. Many of you have ordered these books. They're available. I think Tom Davis at Research has them. The book titled The Senate Hearings on the Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders. This is a report done by the Senate in 1975, and it goes into the role of the United States government in trying to arrange the murder of Castro, which they weren't able to do, Fidel Castro, into the murder of Patrice Lumumba, which was done, of Rafael Trujillo, which was done, of Dr. Salvador Allende, which was done, of General Rene Schneider, which was done, and also Mr. Diem from Vietnam. Now you notice how effective our coups are and how happy everyone was after we did them. The countries are in total disarray and never really recovered from the way that we handled them and overthrew their governments. But I'm going to cite an article that was in the Washington Post. This was April 25th, 1986, titled United States Presses Ethiopian Regime with Rhetoric and Covert Action. It's not very covert. It's such a contradiction. We're threatening to overthrow the government. This is written by 2 people, Patrick Tyler, Tyler, and David Ottaway. I called Tyler, and remember that name because someday it'll come up again covering another big story. And I told him what was happening here and that this fellow who had been asked to do these actions and refused, his life is in danger, he's in hiding, and he's in serious trouble because he turned down what they expected him to produce in exchange for housing and education and a location for his wife and children. Mr. Tyler said, it's impossible, I'm not interested. The CIA never did a political assassination. I said, you can't think of one? He said, no, not one. You can't think that they would plan that? He said, no, they wouldn't plan that. But on the other hand, this is the article he wrote, sections of it, from the Washington Post. He says, right now, there are between 20,000 and 30,000 Africans dying of AIDS. And this is a cause of concern to people. It's also a form of a genocide. And Aid for Africa is a commercial adventure that raised millions of dollars. And the question, of course, out of this article is, did it go to the hands of the Central Intelligence Agency? And he writes that Vernon Walters is the head of the UN, of course, was very active with the CIA role in interfering with the abduction of a CIA agent that added tensions in Ethiopia. And the article goes on, there's a picture of Vernon Walters here, as there is one in the paper, as he is getting ready to drop the bombs on Libya. He wants to use the CIA, and he works with the United Nations, and get them involved in covert action, obviously in Ethiopia. And he was very active in releasing a CIA agent in 1984, 2 years ago, who was abducted and tortured by the Ethiopian police. The gentleman was released in February of 1984. The authors don't mention his name. He lives in Washington, and he also has homes in California, which is interesting considering that this fellow was brought over here from California and given a little bit in the way of favors of education and now asked to go back and do these murders. The abduction of a CIA officer took place in February 86, and Vernon Walters, as ambassador at large for Ronald Reagan, went to Addis Ababa, the capital, and got his release based upon Mossad intelligence. And since 1981, when Ronald Reagan became president and was inaugurated, he has spent $500,000 a year trying to overthrow Ethiopia. The money's to support propaganda, resistance tactics, anti-communist information, and to support dissidents who help with the overthrow. And the article says, recently, senior administration officials were planning covert military training of armed guerrillas committed to overthrowing the regime. Now, the important thing about the Senate hearings on political assassinations is that we take native population to kill people in their own state. We just don't have the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants standing up there just shooting them and saying, we want the country. We put a lot of money into the native population to get the coup going. The Washington Post says no decision has been made by the White House to provide munitions or other lethal aid. And that's when I called Patrick Tyler, the Washington Post, because hiring somebody to kill heads of states in Ethiopia sounds like lethal aid. I'll give you education, I'll give you housing, and you get on over there, you speak the language. That sounds like lethal aid, and so that's why I approached this particular person, but he didn't think that that was important or even necessarily true. The article continues, since the fall, this past fall, Reagan has escalated his rhetoric, and rhetoric is the thing that Patrick Buchanan has brought in to do. There's a long article recently on hiring people to help him with the rhetoric, and he's talking about Soviet-style governments, and he includes the government of Mr. Mengistu of Ethiopia, and says it's one of the close allies of the Soviet Union. And Reagan and George Shultz refer to freedom fighters and Ethiopian freedom fighters, although they've had trouble finding anti-communists that will support the Reagan doctrine. As freedom fighters are brought to the United States, as I say, given education, given money, put on a leash and said, go back and kill somebody, and you'll have a hunk of money, evidently, and if you don't, you'll be killed. The article in the Washington Post says the conservatives in and out of the administration are pressing the Reagan doctrine in Ethiopia. Those conservatives are the Heritage Foundation, Stanford University, Rand Corporation, Henry Kissinger, Richard Allen, advisors to the Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies, the very same people who gave us, as of 1981, the rhetoric that the Bulgarians and the KGB tried to shoot Pope John Paul II. The Ethiopian agent that was abducted was working under diplomatic cover of the United States, of the UN, and of course Jeane Kirkpatrick was UN ambassador before Vernon Walters was employed there, and he was actually deeply involved with anti-government resistance cells, and the CIA officer in Ethiopia and the deputy director under there were all kicked out. They directed a covert propaganda program to overthrow the government in Ethiopia, and their hope was to guide an anti-communist opposition to get political support and armed guerrilla forces started. The CIA has identified the resistance group that worked with them called the EDPA. That's Ethiopian People's Democratic Alliance. The Ethiopian Democratic People's Alliance, the words, of course, are rearranged in Foreign Translation Office. The EDPA is based in London, and London is where the Phil Collins concert got together, where the idea for aid for Ethiopia was, and it received wide support in London in 1981. The U.S. Office for International Development, AID, has provided hundreds of millions in emergency relief over the past 2 years, and now they want to stop this, and a senior aid official, Mr. Peter McPherson, is convinced that the Ethiopian government's policies of resettlement are wrong and that they're Soviet style, and they want to stop AID and money for these food shortages because Ethiopia hasn't changed its Marxist connections and refuses to become part of the Reagan doctrine. In 1981, Reagan signed what was a National Security Act finding that authorized the CIA to conduct its non-lethal campaign to support the resistance to Mengistu's regime. And again, these are the lies that in Ethiopia that Daniel Ellsberg was talking about in Vietnam, but which haven't changed, whether it's in Afghanistan or Angola or Nicaragua or Ethiopia. The people's third world governments don't have a chance to develop their own economy And Ellsberg talked about the dictatorships that put in organizations such as United Fruit and so forth, and that were hell-bent in overthrowing any people's parties or giving them a chance. Now, the CIA earmarked $500,000 to help the EPDA conduct propaganda war against the government. This included a CIA contact in Washington, D.C., a consultant, and Washington consultants for the CIA wrote the anti-government propaganda. They criticized the Ethiopians for internal policies. They sent audio tapes, videotapes, anti-Mengistu speeches by leading exiles from the United States and Europe that were shipped in diplomatic pouches, and this is where Vernon Walters can be useful, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, in sending these pouches with the propaganda that will overthrow these particular governments. The EPDA planned in October of 1982 to train, with CIA money in the Sudan, 300 guerrilla leaders to infiltrate the Ethiopian organization, a resistance movement, and I'm citing these articles from the Washington Post on the developments over in Ethiopia because of their links to Vernon Walters and the intelligence community and the role that the UN plays in pouches, sending information to don't trust your government, don't like your government, and actually plan to overthrow the government. And even the Washington Post cites the location of Ethiopia and how strategic it is on the Red Sea. And I've cited the way that Libya is connected to the Mediterranean, that we go for geography and build up these people for whatever we want to do in order to have strategic bases to make that war against the Soviet Union. Now, when Vernon Walters went over there, he wanted the release of this agent, this particular agent, and also after the agent was released to Vernon Walters, 3 diplomats were kicked out of Ethiopia, the CIA station chief at the embassy, the deputy station chief, and another CIA operator that were operating under diplomatic cover. And they were sent, this one particular person was sent to Washington, D.C., and he was given some treatment for the torture, which he in fact did get. But remember that Frank Turpel, the Central Intelligence Agency, taught Idi Amin a few things about torture, and that the CIA can teach the most treacherous torture and condone it, but when it comes from a Marxist Ethiopian regime, it seems all wrong. So the CIA has been criticizing this government and has escalated from sending a few advisors to having a large-scale covert action. And as I say, they describe in this article that Ethiopia is strategically located on the Horn of Africa, and so that there's going to be a more confrontational course. Now, Reagan, in the fall of 1985, this past fall, provided $15 million for paramilitary forces in Angola and Afghanistan, and this includes Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and now he wants to escalate the war to overthrow Mengistu. And as I said, he's not even satisfied with Mr. Mubarak, but I don't think it'll be long before Mubarak will be killed. And the United States wants to control the Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Libya, and watch the way these countries go, because in wanting to control the world, they're closing in on all these small countries and will not stop at anything until we literally make them all part and parcel of our policies and our particular desires. Now, the Eritrean people have a liberation movement over in Ethiopia, but it isn't very strong. There's a group, the Tigrans, who are not very strong. And just as in Cuba and in Nicaragua, the people are not willing to change governments and don't want to change governments. So the problem that Ronald Reagan is having is finding the right people to move in and get rid of the Mengistu regime. And this is why it would probably be necessary to kill high officials and blame a leftist, a new Lee Harvey Oswald with a diary, who comes from California, Little Cabrillo College, while we run offices of the United Nations that are sending people to do assassinations right here in California. The Washington Post goes on to the efforts of the groups to distribute literature and so forth, and that the Ethiopians are not responding to this activity, and that indicates, of course, that we will have to use some bloody means to get what we want. In October 1985, Ronald Reagan was before the United Nations, and he listed Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Angola, and Nicaragua as being at war imposed from without, that Russia is running them, and that doesn't make a difference between their being imposed from Russia as against our United States deciding who runs Chile, who runs Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, where the CIA put in a coup, and Pakistan, or Grenada, or Guyana, you name it. The United States has actually come in and set operations for murders and put in this system of repression and literal slavery of these people. But we continue to say that the Soviet Union isn't giving these particular people that he cites their freedom, while the elected president of South Korea or Chile doesn't give up his presidency, or the Chang family in Taiwan. And we keep fingering the Soviet Union, and that is part of Reagan's reality, that he has created the illusion that these countries would be free if it weren't for the Marxists, and that we are the freedom fighters trying to get the bad Russians off their backs. Now, the Soviet Union is a threat to some people. I guarantee that you might lose your freedom in exchange for your home and your jobs and a lot of other things that they think people are entitled to. But the inconsistency of thinking that a dictatorship, some of these dictatorships in El Salvador, Guatemala, and so forth, are better than life in the Soviet Union is not true, and that is part of Ronald Reagan's problem and the way the media has to rearrange our brain cells to erase that reality and give us another truth, which he is so brilliant at doing. Now, there's a bill in Congress sponsored by Representative Toby Roth of Wisconsin and Representative Stephen Solaris of New York, formally listing Ethiopia as a communist country so that there would be the loss of export-import bank loans, and they would lose favorable terms with the United States, and an embargo would come against the Marxist government because they are having, in quotes, a resettlement program. They are having a resettlement program which is causing a lot of anxiety and starvation, but the problem of the American Indian resettlement program, or putting them where they know they will die and starve, is not anything that is addressed very seriously. Another article that was important recently was the one of the man in charge of the top relief money who fled to the United States, taking with him $300,000, but goodness knows what else. This is from the Houston Post, May the 8th. Ethiopia admits official fled. Money for famine relief was allegedly stolen. The money was stolen in the fall of 1985. And the article says the Ethiopia's top relief official for the 1984-85 famine relief, remembered the music and the aid to Ethiopia, fled to the United States with hundreds of thousands of dollars of famine aid money. Dawit Wold-Georgis, Giorgis, was in contact with Voice of America, another CIA front. Voice of America run by Knights of Malta such as James Buckley, Frank Shakespeare, and Vernon Walters, an entire establishment of media disinformation and scrambling of messages for these people. He was in touch with Voice of America, and Brian McClure conversed with him, and then he came to the United States and took the funds. Now, that isn't a large amount of money when you're talking about millions of dollars, but the Ethiopian government said that Mr. Athwat Georgis, betrayed his country and exchanged his dignity for personal freedom. They were furious that he came here. He's a person who was identified with the poor, with the homeless, with the starving, and a lot of people put a lot of money through his hands. The charge that he betrayed his country and exchanged his dignity for personal gain has to be thought of in terms of what this fellow is trying to do up here in Santa Cruz at Cabrillo College, is to not do the murders, to go to Congressman Leon Panetta, to go to the courts, to file a case, to not betray his country for his personal gain, which is exactly the opposite. And in this Cold War, hot war, there are heroes, people who are standing up. And next week, I have his name, but I don't want to endanger his life. I'll give it to you next week with his permission, okay? So that if he is murdered, you'll know why he was murdered. We can't keep this a secret much longer. That's why I'm talking about it this evening. But here's a person who has put his life on the line. Now, last week I saw an obituary. It's among a lot of articles that I went through, literally hundreds of important stories, and I'll get the exact facts for you. But it's about a soldier stationed at Fort Ord who was about ready to be discharged, who was picked up on a parking ticket up in Berkeley, California, and came back to Monterey County here at Fort Ord and was drowned right outside the ocean there by the Fort Ord base. And he's from Nigeria. And I wonder now if I could look into that subject, if he was supposed to go back and do some of these activities and refused, just as this particular person I'm talking about and was drowned at Fort Ord. That's what I fear, that this gentleman who refused the offer to work under the United Nations Relief Aid for Africa to do murders can, in fact, be murdered quickly by the administration for telling the story and taking it to the courts. But this article from the Houston Post talks about the Voice of America, the broadcast in Amharic language near Kenya, and that's when the officials from Ethiopia learned where the fellow running the money for the aid was. It was picked up from Voice of America, who knew where he was, and these people worked closely with Vernon Walters. And this was the first official acknowledgement that he had defected as of October 85, that he left Ethiopia. He went to Europe and then the United States on the grounds to, in quote, solicit more funds for the famine relief, and the Western diplomats and foreign relief agencies assumed that he left for good and was in the United States. He has homes in California and in London, and London is the offices of the intelligence community to overthrow the government of Ethiopia, just as London is the headquarters, or was until they moved to Uruguay, of the Sikh organization. I'm sure there's many in London, to overthrow the administration of Mrs. Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, and they work closely, those Sikhs, with the intelligence community in the United States and with high-up officials. So we have to find out what cities Dawit has homes in, whether it would be Bakersfield or up in Santa Cruz or Capitola, and what are the connections. Now, these embezzled funds don't seem like much when you're raising millions of dollars, but he allegedly took $300,000 from the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission and distributed to relatives in California and in Maryland, and that's where the CIA headquarters are. So maybe this person who was expected to produce used some of this money for the killing, because I'm sure it isn't on the payroll of some dummy front in Cabrillo College, or in the offices there up in Santa Cruz or Aptos. It has to come through some other means that he gets the money to go back to Europe and do these murders, and there's probably a lot more waiting if he agreed to do them. For 2 years, Dawit led the commission, the main government agency coordinating the international famine relief operation, and he's known internationally for his pleas to aid the drought-stricken nation, and now it turns out that he, in fact, is very much part of the United States with real estate here and got the emotions of the people going, and then could turn the aid for Ethiopia to the relocation and accuse the Marxists for the famine and so forth. Now, one other subject I want to get to before our time is out, and this again has to do with information and truth and how you make truth appear as a certain reality when the facts don't support it and the evidence is destroyed. A very typical way that I studied with the Warren Commission and the people covering up the murder of John Kennedy was the destruction of evidence. Now, the Los Angeles Times ran a large story that was also on the evening news this past week, titled "Probe is Told." This is the probe into the shuttle explosion, the Challenger. William Rogers Committee was told that the notes were destroyed that they subpoenaed from Huntsville, Alabama. Now, those Huntsville Project Paperclip scientists, I've linked to the Torbett document, to Permindex, to the murder of John Kennedy, to Allen Dulles. So again, it isn't out of Fort Lauderdale or Cape Canaveral. It's not out of Houston. The Rogers Commission wanted papers on the shuttle, and again, it's that little clique down there in Huntsville, Alabama, that have the strongest links to the escalating of World War III, and to Kurt Waldheim, and to William Donovan and William Casey and Allen Dulles, the late Allen Dulles, the late Donovan. But the seeds were planted when they were brought to this country long before the war was over. And now, as the Challenger is being investigated, they've destroyed these papers. Why is it important? I did at least 7 hours almost continuously on the Challenger, saying that the Huntsville people wanted and would let the Challenger explode, that they were testing the O-rings, knowing that they could blow up, but seeing if they hold under this intense cold, that nothing is lost because they will get a new spaceship anyway, and they could unload one that was a bummer by having people see it visibly. They were shocked and could quickly put in money for a new one, which is business for all the same corporations that were there before, and then they bring in Mr. Fletcher, who was part of the original problem, to cover it up really nicely, and this is like the son-in-law of Allen Dulles recommending Kurt Waldheim to the foreign minister of Austria. Mr. Fletcher is brought in to carry on the NASA program after the shuttle program after this horrible experience. The Los Angeles Times says the Presidential Commission, William Rogers, probing the Challenger space shuttle accident, launched an investigation from anonymous charges that written material concerning the spacecraft's flawed booster rocket were destroyed after they were ordered impounded by NASA. Commission sources said they were sent people right to Marshall Space Center at Huntsville, Alabama, late Thursday after William Rogers received an unsigned letter, certainly not the courage of Daniel Ellsberg, or they would have signed it and said why, saying that material was destroyed and discarded. The latest twist of the 3.5-month investigation was disclosed near the end of the commission work, near the completion of it, and they're supposed to have a report ready by June the 6th. William Rogers said that he would take appropriate action, which is ridiculous, and that his decision to order the investigation to Huntsville shortly after removed evidence, right after they got a letter asking for this material. NASA Administrator James Fletcher ordered the agency's own inspector general to look into the charges, and that's like the Prime Minister, again, of Austria and the future son-in-law of Alan Dulles looking in or not looking into the case of Kurt Waldheim. The article goes on that files at the Marshall Space Center were discarded and destroyed, that they were promised from NASA that there was appropriate material in there for them to study, and that the focus of the accident had been on the solid rocket boosters, and that the Alabama Space Center, which has responsibility for the shuttle system, was at the center of destroying these papers. A source familiar with a letter sent by the Presidential Commission said that the material assembled at Marshall in response to requests from investigators that were passed up through channels at the Space Center, and that orders were given to keep documents at the center. If relevant documents sought by the Commission have been destroyed, it would change the entire complexion of the investigation, said Senator Albert Gore of Tennessee. Now, if you think in mind that the car of John Kennedy was destroyed before it could be examined, that his coat was locked up and not allowed to be examined for the fibers, that John Connolly's coat and shirt were destroyed by dry cleaning in his trousers, and that there were 28 pieces of important evidence destroyed by the officials in Dallas and by those who should have turned them over to the Warren Commission when it was appointed. They systematically not only destroyed evidence but killed witnesses. And the LA Times goes into the operation of destroying very important information that would indicate that the solid rocket booster would in fact be destroyed. And then there's a gentleman from Morton Theocol who at first defends these people, and he said it's not the bureaucratic way to have only one copy of anything. There are zillions of people on distribution lists. But then he goes on, of course, I'm the same guy who said Richard Nixon couldn't alter those tapes, so how do I know? And the others might be destroyed. Remember, as soon as the shuttle went down and the offices were closed for 5 hours, and I said they were erasing phone conversations or the links of the White House to NASA, ordering them to launch, but they also could be very nicely, when it comes to the solid rocket booster, destroying this evidence, knowing, because the Rogers Commission knew within the day it opened what they were looking for, and their original hypothesis held true. The LA Times says sources close to the commission and the final investigation report will focus on much of the criticism on NASA's decision-making process and the role of the Huntsville Center the night before the launch. And the Marshall officials publicly refused to acknowledge any mistakes they made, and that the joint seals of the booster and the waivers that permitted the flight to continue would have information that now has been destroyed about the problems that will remain unsolved. When they ordered the machine to go up, they knew there were problems, and now the information on those has been destroyed, and I'm sure there aren't a zillion copies of this anywhere at all. Another article about the Space Center, as much as I have time for in a minute or two, from the Washington Post, April 23rd. NASA choice as director, James C. Fletcher, holds an interest in the space firm. The company lobbies for private shuttle. He has an interest. Remember, I said that on my program that they were going to swing the shuttle program into all military, then give private companies the right to send up their own shuttles separate from the military, and build, which would really be militarily linked but would look like civilian. And the Washington Post says that James Fletcher, the new head of NASA, has gotten more than $45,000 in director's fees last year and owns up to $50,000 in stock in Astrotech International Corporation, which is the very firm I mentioned before, that is among Fletcher's financial holdings that is worth between $1 and $4 million and has several aerospace interests. Astrotech's subsidiary, General Space, has been lobbying for NASA in recent weeks on a controversial proposal to privately finance a new shuttle orbiter. Astrotech's chairman, Willard Rockwell, who founded Rockwell International, has met in the White House with Chief of Staff Donald Reagan and acting NASA Director William Graham about the proposal. So here is the new appointed James C. Fletcher, who was part of the problem from the 70s on building this shuttle that was dangerous and could blow up. And he has a big hunk of money in a private firm that is speaking with the president and the chief of staff of making the civilian group under that nose while the other becomes military. And that was one of the motives that I said there was for blowing up the shuttle. Now, a lot of you, when I speak about blowing up the shuttle or allowing it to happen, you have to hear my past broadcasts that are available on why I argued that the shuttle was expendable and the reasons why I believe so. This is Mae Brussell. It's time to sign off now. I'll be back with you next week, and take care and keep up reading that news, and we'll share some more information on World Watchers in about 7 days. Bye-bye.